The snow wasn't gentle, it was a sharp, biting thing thrown from a bruised purple sky that found every gap in Nola's warm wool coat. Each flake that landed on her cheek felt like a tiny needle of ice, a final penance after 10 hours of scrubbing marble floors and polishing chrome fixtures that cost more than her entire life. She moved through the London twilight as an invisible person, her dark blue uniform and white apron hidden beneath her coat, a reminder of the silent ghost she became from 9 to 7. She worked at the pinnacle, a spire of glass and steel that clawed at the clouds, where the air itself seemed filtered and expensive. Usually, she only saw the resident of the penthouse as a silent storm in a perfectly tailored suit, a man who moved like the world owed him space. Victor Sakis was power made flesh, his face carved from unforgiving stone. But tonight, that power was gone. As Nola rounded the corner onto the grand, heated driveway, she found him sitting on the lowest marble step. He was a statue of ruin. His charcoal suit was rumpled and dusted with snow, and his dark hair, usually styled with surgical precision, was disheveled. He wasn't just sitting, he was folded in on himself, his head bowed in a way that signaled his unshakable certainty had been shattered. Beside him on the wet pavement sat 2 simple bags, the only things his betrayers had let him take. The family had spoken, the penthouse was sealed, and the king had been deposed upon his own crumbling throne of marble. If you have ever walked past someone broken on a cold street and told yourself it was none of your business, this story is for you. It's about the 3 words a woman with nothing to spare gave to a man the world had already buried. And what it cost her. And what it made her. And why he would spend the rest of his life making sure the debt was paid. Nola had 3 rules about London. Don't make eye contact on the tube. Don't slow down in the rain. And never, under any circumstances, stop walking when something on the street looked like trouble. She had kept all 3 rules for 6 years without exception. She broke the 3rd one at 11:47 on a Thursday night, in the snow, in front of a man whose neck tattoos she could read from 4 feet away. She didn't know why she stopped. Or rather, she knew exactly why and refused to name it, because naming it would make it a choice, and she wasn't ready for it to be a choice. She told herself she stopped because her bag strap had slipped. She told herself she stopped because the cold had snatched her breath and she needed a second. She stood on the pavement at the edge of those wide marble steps and told herself a series of small, dignified lies while Victor Sakis sat in the snow and stared at the ground between his shoes. He was folded in on himself in a way she had never seen a large man fold. Not broken, she knew what broken looked like, had seen it in the mirror at 23 after her mother's funeral, had seen it in the women at the shelter where she volunteered on Sundays. This was something different. This was a man who had always occupied space like a declaration, now pulling every inch of himself inward, as though he was trying to take up less of a world that had already taken everything else. The Louis Vuitton bag sat to his left. The little red backpack sat between his feet. Snow caught in the chain at his throat and did not melt. Nola's mouth opened before she had given it permission. Stay with me. 3 words. Barely above the sound of the falling snow. She wasn't even sure, for one lurching second, that she had said them out loud at all, until he looked up. His eyes were dark and still and extraordinarily tired. They moved across her face the way a man reads something he doesn't trust himself to believe. She didn't look away. She stood there in her dark blue uniform, canvas bag on her shoulder, snow in her braids, and she held his gaze and did not take it back. Her apartment was not built for a man like Victor Sakis. It was built for one person living carefully, a single bed pushed against the wall, a kitchenette where two people could not stand side by side without negotiating, a window that looked out onto a brick wall and, if you pressed your forehead against the glass at a specific angle, a narrow strip of grey London sky. Nola had made it decent. She had made it hers. Curtains she'd sewn herself, a second-hand armchair she'd dragged up for flights of stairs with her neighbour Mrs. Osei, a small shelf of books arranged by colour because she liked the way it looked when she came home tired. Victor stood in the middle of it and made it small in a way she hadn't anticipated. He didn't do anything. That was the thing. He set his bags down near the door with a quiet precision that suggested he was already calculating exit routes, and then he simply stood, and the room reorganized itself around him the way a room does when something too large for it has been introduced. He was a black hole of silence. He pulled the air differently. Even still, even saying nothing, even with snow melting into the shoulders of his ruined suit, he was the most present thing in any space he occupied. Nola put the kettle on because she needed something to do with her hands. She heard him behind her, the soft drag of fabric as he removed his jacket, and when she turned to ask if he took sugar she stopped asking about sugar entirely. His arms were covered from wrist to shoulder, ink so dense in places it looked like armor, thin lines of script she couldn't read layered over imagery she could. A dragon ran from his left elbow to beneath his collar, its tail disappearing under his sleeve, its scales drawn with a precision that spoke of hours and intention and a life sworn to something ancient and serious. He caught her looking. She turned back to the kettle. "Milk," she said. A pause long enough to mean several things. "No," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the accent smoothed but not erased, like a stone that had been carried a long way in a fast river. She made the tea. Her hands were almost steady. She woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of an engine that wasn't moving. Most engines on her street moved. They belonged to night shift workers and minicab drivers and the occasional delivery van that had no business being in a residential road at that hour. This one had pulled up and stopped, and the stopping was what woke her, that specific silence an engine makes when it has arrived somewhere and is waiting, deliberately, for something to happen next. Nola lay still for 3 seconds, then rose and crossed to the window in the dark. The sedan was black and wide and parked directly below. No plates she could read from this angle. No one getting out. The engine idled with a low, expensive patience that was somehow worse than urgency would have been. Urgency meant panic. Patience meant planning. She felt Victor before she heard him. A shift in the dark behind her, the particular displacement of air that preceded him everywhere, and then he was beside her at the window, not touching the curtain, not silhouetted, standing just far enough back that the light from the street wouldn't find him. He looked down at the sedan for a long moment. "How long have we got?" Nola asked. She surprised herself with the "we." "Long enough," he said, "for me to tell you something you should have known before you invited me in." He didn't look at her when he said it. He kept his eyes on the street below. His lieutenants had been skimming, not from the organization's coffers, but from a debt owed to a rival syndicate, a debt Victor had personally guaranteed. When the syndicate came to collect, someone in his inner circle made a quiet calculation. Easier to hand Victor over than pay back what they'd stolen. His sister had been the leverage, taken first, released only after Victor walked into a meeting he already knew was a trap and signed over every asset, every account, every safe house address, in exchange for her life. He had walked out with 2 bags and the clothes on his back. And apparently, with someone's eyes still on him. "You should have left me on those steps," he said. Below, the sedan's engine cut out. Nola let the curtain fall and stepped back from the window. "Probably," she said. "Go wake up the couch." They came at 4 a.m., which Victor had apparently expected, because he was already awake and dressed and standing in the kitchenette drinking water when the stairwell door 1 floor below opened with the specific careful quietness of men who did not want to be heard. He set the glass down without a sound. "Bathroom," he said. One word, no inflection, the way you speak to someone when the time for explanation has already passed. Nola went. She pulled the door almost closed and stood against the cold tile wall and listened to her own breathing and told herself to keep it quiet. What happened next she experienced in fragments, sound without vision, which was somehow worse than seeing it. A knock that was not really a knock. The door coming off its chain in one hard movement. Victor's voice saying nothing at all. Then the first impact. She had expected gunshots. What she heard instead was the brutal percussion of close-quarters violence, weight meeting resistance, the crack of something rigid against something harder, a grunt that was cut short with unsettling efficiency. The scrape of the kitchenette stool across the floor. Glass breaking, not the drinking glass, something larger. A sound she couldn't identify and chose not to try. Then a longer silence. Then Victor saying, quietly and without particular emotion, "You can come out." She opened the bathroom door. 2 men were on her floor. She didn't look at them for long. Her eyes went to Victor instead, because looking at Victor was easier, and because what she saw there was information she understood she needed. He was standing in the center of the room with his shirt torn at the shoulder and a cut above his left eyebrow that was bleeding in a thin, patient line down his temple. He was breathing. He was not breathing hard. Her curtain rod was bent. Her armchair had moved 3 feet. The kettle was on the floor. Victor picked up his jacket from the hook by the door, still there, somehow, still on its hook, and put it on over the torn shirt with a composure that made something in Nola's chest go very quiet. "We need to leave," he said. She looked at her small, rearranged, ruined apartment. "I know," she said. She picked up her bag. They were in a transit hotel near Paddington when she saw her own face on the television. Victor had paid cash for the room. She hadn't asked where the cash came from, had added it to the growing list of things she was deliberately not examining, and they had been there 4 hours, long enough for Nola to shower and for Victor to change the dressing on his eyebrow with a precision that suggested this was not his first time. The television had been on low in the background, a reflex she had reached for without thinking, the kind of ordinary habit that feels like an anchor when everything else is moving too fast. And then her name. And then her photograph, her work ID photograph, the one she'd always hated, her face too serious, the uniform collar too stiff, and beneath it, in the clean white font of a news ticker, the words "person of interest" sitting against her chest like something cold and permanent. She stood very still. The report was brief and confident and wrong about almost everything except her name and her face, which it had correctly and publicly attached to 2 men found in a residential flat in connection with an ongoing investigation. It did not say what the men had come there to do. It did not say who had sent them. It said person of interest again as though repetition made it more precisely true, and then it moved on to traffic. Nola sat down on the edge of the hotel bed. She thought about her 6 years of early mornings and late finishes and keeping her head down and building something small and stable and entirely hers. She thought about Mrs. Osei, who would have seen the news by now. She thought about her Sunday shifts at the shelter, and her shelf of books arranged by color, and the curtains she had sewn herself that were probably evidence now. Victor said nothing. He watched her from across the room and gave her the silence like something he owed her. When she looked up, her voice was steady. "Tell me what you need to get it all back," she said. "Your organization. The proof. All of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "It's inside the building where you work," he said. She almost laughed. "Almost." "Of course it is," she said. The plan, such as it was, began with a confession. Nola unzipped the inner pocket of her canvas satchel, the one beneath the false bottom she'd sewn in herself after a colleague had her wages stolen on the tube, and produced a keycard so worn its printed logo had faded to a ghost. She held it between two fingers and set it on the small hotel table between them without ceremony. Victor looked at it. Then at her. "Master access," she said. "Cleaning services. Every floor, every service corridor, every utility room in the building." She paused. "I was supposed to return it when they rotated the codes 18 months ago. There was a mix-up with the contractor list and my name fell off the deactivation register. I kept meaning to hand it in." "But you didn't," Victor said. "I didn't," she agreed. She didn't explain why. She wasn't entirely sure she could have, only that something in her had recognized the card as the one small power she possessed in a building full of people who looked through her, and she had held onto it the way you hold onto anything that makes you feel like you exist. Victor picked it up. Turned it over once with the careful attention he gave to everything, as though objects, like people, revealed more on their second side. "They changed the executive floor locks after the takeover," he said, almost to himself. "But the service infrastructure runs on a separate system. Older. They wouldn't have thought to change it." He set the card down. "They never think about the cleaners." "No," Nola said. "They never do." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood. It was gone before she could be certain it had been there at all. He was quiet for a moment, turning the shape of it over in his mind, and she could see him doing it, mapping corridors, calculating timing, weighing variables with the systematic focus of a man who had built an empire from precisely this kind of thinking. "You go in uniform," he said finally. "Same as any other morning. I come in through the loading bay." He met her eyes. "You've done this shift 100 times. 412, she said. He looked at her. "I counted," she said simply. "It's a long shift." She had ironed the uniform the night before, which felt absurd given the circumstances, but her hands had needed something to do and the iron had been there, and some habits are deeper than logic. She put it on in the grey pre-dawn light of the hotel bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. Dark blue dress, white apron, the small embroidered logo on the breast pocket she had stopped seeing years ago. She looked exactly like what she had been for 6 years. Invisible. Unremarkable. A woman whose job was to make other people's messes disappear. She picked up her satchel and the keycard and went to meet Victor. He had acquired, through means she continued not to examine, a set of dark utility coveralls and a contractor's lanyard with a photograph that was not quite him but close enough for a guard doing an early shift who had not yet finished his first coffee. He looked her over when she emerged. Said nothing. Gave a single nod that meant ready and also, she had learned, meant good. They entered separately. Nola walked through the main service entrance at 5:43 a.m., the way she had walked through it 412 times before, canvas satchel on her shoulder, eyes forward, pace unhurried. The security guard on the desk was new since her suspension, but the dynamic was not. she held up the keycard with the practiced ease of someone who belonged there, and he waved her through without looking up from his screen. She did not exhale until the service corridor swallowed her. Victor came in through the loading bay 12 minutes later. She knew because she felt the shift in the building's atmosphere before she heard his footsteps in the utility passage, that particular change in air pressure that preceded him, the sense of something large and deliberate moving through a space and rearranging its priorities accordingly. He materialized from the shadow beside the service elevator with the controlled silence of a man who had been moving through other people's buildings in the dark for 20 years. 2 floors up, a guard was making his rounds. Victor watched the man's reflection in the elevator panel, calculated something she couldn't follow, and made a single quiet decision with his body that cleared the corridor in under 40 seconds. She didn't ask. He didn't explain. The elevator doors opened. They stepped inside. The spire swallowed them whole. The ledger was exactly where Victor said it would be. A false panel behind the drinks cabinet on the 43rd floor, thin as a secret, containing a single encrypted drive and a physical record book whose pages held enough names and numbers to dismantle 3 criminal organizations and embarrass 2 members of parliament. Nola found it in 40 seconds flat because she had cleaned that cabinet every Thursday for 2 years and had always thought the wall behind it sounded different when she knocked against it by accident. She had never thought to wonder why until now. She was sliding it into her satchel when the elevator opened. There were 4 of them. She recognized the one in front from the sedan outside her flat, the patient one, the one who had sat in an idling car at 2 a.m. and waited with the quiet confidence of a man who always collected what he came for eventually. He saw the satchel. He saw her hands. He looked past her for Victor with the focused irritation of someone who has come a long way for a specific problem. Victor stepped out of the shadow beside the window. What followed was not cinematic. It was close and loud and ferociously ugly in the way that real violence always is, not choreographed but desperate, not elegant but effective, for men who had come to finish something meeting one man who had decided it ended here. Nola pressed herself behind the solid bulk of the mahogany desk and stayed low and kept the satchel against her chest and focused on breathing because breathing was the only useful thing available to her. Then a shot that was meant for the desk found the air above her head instead, and Victor was there, between her and the room, one hand braced on the desk's edge, bleeding from somewhere she couldn't identify, his body a wall she had not asked for and could not argue with. "Stay down," he said. She stayed down. When the silence came, it came completely, the way silence does after something very loud. Victor crouched in front of her. He took her face in both hands, ink-mapped, careful, enormous, and looked at her with an expression she had no existing language for. "You," he said, very quietly, "are the only thing in this room that belongs to me." She held his gaze and did not look away. She was getting good at that. The drive took 72 hours to unravel everything. Victor's lawyer, a precise, grey-haired woman named Castellan who asked no questions Nola could hear and charged, she suspected, accordingly, had the physical ledger authenticated and the digital files distributed to 3 separate recipients before the men who wanted them buried even knew they were gone. By the time the syndicate understood what had happened, the information was already moving through channels that could not be closed, toward people who could not be silenced, and the lieutenants who had sold Victor Sakis for their own survival were discovering, one by one, what it cost to be on the wrong side of a man who had nothing left to lose and a reason, finally, to fight for something beyond himself. It took 4 more days for the organization to fold back into his hands. He did not celebrate. He did not make speeches. He walked back into the building on a grey Tuesday morning, and the men who remained, the ones who had not betrayed him, the ones who had simply waited, stood when he entered the room, and that was enough. Nola was there because he had asked her to be, which was the only reason she would have come. They stood at the window on the 43rd floor in the early evening, London spread below them in its vast indifferent glitter, the Thames a dark ribbon catching the last of the light. She still had her canvas satchel. He still had the cut above his eyebrow, healed now to a thin pale line that she suspected he would carry permanently. "You should have left me on those steps," he said. It was the second time he had said it. She suspected it was his way of saying something else entirely. "You keep saying that," she said. "I keep meaning it differently," he said. She looked out at the city she had cleaned and navigated and survived for 6 years on its outermost edges, invisible, careful, taking up as little space as possible. Victor turned from the window and looked at her with the particular stillness she had learned, by now, to read. "You were the maid," he said. "You are not the maid anymore." Nola considered the city below. The spires. The lights. The cold and indifferent and magnificent sprawl of it. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not." She left the building that night through the front entrance. Not the service corridor. Not the loading bay. Not the utility passage with its flickering strip lights and its smell of cleaning fluid and decades of unnoticed labor. She walked through the main lobby with its marble floors she had scrubbed on her hands and knees, past the security desk whose guards had waved her through without eye contact for 6 years, and out through the glass doors into the London night. Victor walked beside her. No one looked through her this time. Some doors, once opened, cannot be mistaken for walls again. Nola had spent 6 years making herself small in a city that rewarded smallness in certain people and called it humility. She had kept her head down and her keycard close and her compassion intact despite every reason the world had given her to spend it more carefully. And on a frozen Thursday night, in the snow, outside a building she had no reason to linger near, she had stopped walking. That decision, small, quiet, made in 3 seconds on a cold pavement, had cost her everything she had built and returned to her something she hadn't known she was missing. Not safety. Not comfort. Not the orderly, careful life she had constructed like a fortress against a city that didn't know her name. Purpose. Weight. The specific dignity of being someone that someone else cannot afford to lose. Victor Sarkis had reclaimed his empire. But Nola understood, in the way that people who have survived difficult things always understand the truth before they find the words for it, that she had not helped him reclaim something old. She had helped him build something new. And she was in it. Right at the center. Unmissable. If this story moved you, stayed with you, or made you stop scrolling for just a moment, that means something. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who show up and do the work and keep their compassion close, they are never as invisible as the world wants them to believe. Like. Share. Subscribe for the next story. The best ones are always about the people nobody saw coming.